Okay, well, thanks, Julie, for the introduction, and also thanks to everybody that is joining us tonight on this webinar. So for those that have never attended one of my webinars, I will really, very briefly introduce myself and tell a little bit about my background. So that is mainly in, my background is mainly in animal and equine science. I have a specialization in equine nutrition and behavior. And after I graduated from my undergrad studies, I continued with a master. And for the research component, so for my thesis, I actually traveled to New Zealand, where I studied yearling racehorses, and particularly looking at the effect of dietary transition from pasture to grain feeding, and from grain feeding back to pasture, and how this affects the gut health of the horse. And also then the onset of hindgut acidosis and laminitis. So it is a topic that we're going to focus on in this webinar. So I hope to relate back to that and some of the findings of that study. So I have a very close relationship with laminitis and the studies that I've done. And I really wanted to continue in this direction. But unfortunately, funding around that time was just very hard to get for this subject, even though it was very popular subject. So after my master's, I moved to Australia, where I founded MBA Equine Services, which is it's an education and research business in integrative nutrition, pasture management, and property design. And I also have coaching and officiating. So I'm also a judge for EA. But just to go one step back, as part of my property and pasture consulting and education, the Equine Permaculture initiative was kind of developed, and it's mainly about sustainable farming strategies that we can apply in lifestyle properties or broad acre farming. And in my case, I have integrated the equine component, so talking about pasture management for horses, feeding management, and husbandry strategies for horses. And we'll get back to that as well in this webinar, when we're going to talk about strategies to reduce the risk. But also, I recently finished my PhD in equine nutrition, and particularly foraging behavior and diet selection, and that's the photo that you see here. That's one of my last trials. And since I finished that last year, I have finally more time to focus on hopefully developing more educational blogs and also articles and books, as well as setting up an online course for equine permaculture. And I will talk about this a little bit later on, with also maybe a bit more information about the next book project that we're trying to get launched. So, okay, so many hats on, but let's get into this webinar. I think that most of you that are joining this webinar will most likely have experience with either their own horses that have laminitis, or had horses with laminitis, or have potentially horses that you want to prevent to get laminitis. So I assume that some form or shape you have had experience with this disorder, and you probably have also some knowledge about this subject. And a lot of this laminitis is always reoccurring back in educational magazines and horse deals and any of the horse magazines. And I think that in a way it is a lot chewed on and then regurgitated, and then it's again presented in a new form. But there's a lot of information has not probably changed that much. It's probably just being a little bit more specific about what are we looking at. Are we looking at a symptom, or are we actually looking at the cause, and are we actually working to deal with the cause? Are we treating, are we getting to the kernel of the problem, or are we working on the symptoms? So kind of the Band-Aid strategy. So that is probably the most I want to talk about, and I hope that you get from this webinar. Okay, so what is laminitis? Often referred to as founder, and it is caused by a malfunction of the attachment between the coffin bone and the inner hoof wall. So if you see here the picture, the figure, the drawing that I made, here is the coffin bone and here's the hoof wall. And this is the cross-section that I want to talk about, because we're going to look at the laminae, and there are two types, so the epidermal and the dermal laminae. And these two types have primary and secondary laminae that interlock with each other to form a bond. So if you look at the cross-section here, you can see those primary laminae. So each hoof contains 600 of these laminae, and then the larger primary laminae have in turn approximately 200 of the smaller secondary laminae. So those are the kind of little tooths that you see on it. And these interlock, and they form a bond, and what we need to be very aware of is that one side, so the epidermal laminae, is consistent of kind of a similar component of the hoof wall. So it has creatine in it, and it doesn't have any blood vessels or nerves. It actually relies on the nutrient diffusion from the dermis. So that's this part, which is what we call the sensitive laminae. And as you can see here, it's a bit that pink color, and that's where we have the connective tissue, as well as we can find blood vessels and nerves in that area. So that's the sensitive part, and that's also where all the blood flow happens. So the epidermal and the dermal laminae are connected by a basement membrane, and that is really the architecture that puts it all together. And the laminae of the foot in the foot of the horse, as you can understand, can endure significant forces as a result of this, well, weight bearing as well as locomotion. So it is a very interesting design, and maybe a lot of people would say it's a very delicate design, but it's actually quite strong unless we get some changes happening like laminitis. So the horse has laminitis when the laminae bond fails and the hoof wall separates from the coffin bone. And as you can see here on the photo on the left, this is probably, obviously you can see that the horse had to be put down. And this is where we can see the real effect when this architecture fails. So when this bond fails, the weight of the horse and the forces of the locomotion can cause the coffin bone to sink into the hoof capsule. And this obviously, as you can see, causes a massive damage to the arteries and the veins and the dermis, as well as the sole of the hoof. And yeah, it's a very painful process, as you can imagine. And you probably, if you have dealt with laminitis in your horse in this phase, you will know that the horse is in severe pain. It's irreversible damage. This is a grade 4, and it's something that we cannot repair anymore. And it's, as you can see, this horse was put down. So a lot of cases, when we get to this stage, we unfortunately have to euthanize the affected horse, which is obviously a very sad happening, and it's, besides colic, one of the biggest killers in our horse population of domestic, leisure horses and sport horses. Okay, so when we're dealing with laminitis, there are actually 3 phases, and most people are probably not really aware of the development phase. It can go quite unnoticed. So in this phase, digital pulses and the distal limb temperature may be apparent, so if you feel the hoof, but there may not be necessarily lameness at this stage. But generally we're dealing with pre-existing problems from 1 or 2 or multiple organ systems, such as, we probably are quite aware of it, the GI tract, the hormone balance, can be skeletal, musculoskeletal problems, immune system, respiratory system, renal, as well as reproduction can all be involved with the onset of laminitis. And as I said, the development phase can go quite unnoticed, and many horse owners will find their pony or their horse already experiencing these clinical signs, which is actually already foot pain and gets us to the acute phase without noticing any of these pre-existing problems. So in the acute phase, depending on the severity, the horse will experience to some degree damage to this laminate tissue. Typically they have foot pain, there's some lameness, and obviously the degree of lameness is in the diagnostics scaled or graded according to the Obel lameness, so 1 to 4. 1 is that it's not so obvious. It may be that the horse is moving from one foot to the other foot. And when you get to 4, you get to the moment where the horse is immobile and is having this very lean back stand and is having potentially even the coffin bone already rotated and touching the sole. So acute phase is generally the way we find the first lameness, and it may, as I said, go together with this rotation. The clinical signs may differ per horse. Some horses are lucky and only experience pain in the foot and don't develop this rotation. And these horses are, well, are quite lucky because they can make a complete recovery. So a lot of people say, oh, if the horse has laminitis, it's a lost case. That's not true. It really depends on how much disattachment has happened. The chronic phase is pretty much when the horse doesn't recover fully or almost recovered and then gets another bout of laminitis, and it has to some degree a bit of displacement. And by radiographs you can determine how if the horse developed any of these earlier displacement, and this is something that a lot of that I advise, but a lot of veterinarians will look at if you're buying a bit of an older horse, or that they look at the hoofs and they may suspect some growth problems or some separation. They may opt for some x-rays to make sure that there's no large displacement when you buy the horse. The chronic phase may last for extended period of time, so it can be months, years, the whole life of the horse. And in my experience as a nutritionist and dealing with laminitic horses, I see it much more of a lifetime thing. I don't think that it fully goes away. It's actually much more like a switch, and the switch has been turned on. You can turn it off by recovery, by proper treatments, and we're going to go into that a bit later. But this switch is always there. It's kind of activated, and you just have to touch it and you know, trigger it by certain pathways, and it may get back. So in a way, you just have a susceptible horse, and you just have to manage it. But if you do it properly, you can get a horse that never get these signs again. But it is difficult. And some may experience, you know, like lameness throughout their life, or at certain times when you ride them a little bit more, or certain footing, and they get a bit of growth patterns happening in the hoof, so multiple lines or rings on the hoof capsule, and I think that most are quite familiar with that. And chronic horses can develop further damage to the laminae attachment and displacement. So pretty much if you have a chronic case and then you get another really acute bout, it's generally very hard to get those horses back. So that's a little bit about the development phase. I'm going the wrong way. So now talking about factors that may trigger laminitis, and I think this is where most people have some information or have an overload of information. So what I want to do is I want to really narrow it down for the talk that we're focusing on, because we're going to talk a bit more about pasture and how pasture can cause laminitis. But first, the primary factors that trigger laminitis are actually not really well understood. I mean, we have obviously research, and I've done myself research on it, and we get all these components, and yes, we know quite a bit about the development of the disease and trigger factors, but still it is much more what we expect a systematic disease. So there's many mechanisms involved in the onset of laminitis that may result in a variety of these pre-existing problems elsewhere in the body that we already talked about, that I already highlighted. And the gastrointestinal tract and the endocrine system are probably the most often involved, and also in relation studied the most. And intake of excess amounts of grain, lush pasture. When we talk about lush pasture, I'm talking about sugar-rich pasture. Obesity, insulin resistance, Cushing, and colic may all also contribute to the onset. So we'll go into that in more detail. But what we know is that there are three main categories of laminitis. So the first one is pretty much the one that is linked by weight bearing. So that's not so relevant to pasture-associated laminitis, but something I just want to highlight. So horses can get laminitis just by hard surface. We have seen it back in the old days. You saw it a lot with carriage horses, obviously on hard stone and hard roads, they seem to develop laminitis just by weight bearing. The other two, the second one is the inflammatory, or what we call systematic inflammatory response syndromes, laminitis. So that can either be caused by a number of things, but the main ones are either sugar, by starch, that can come from cereal grains, or water-soluble carbohydrates, so simple sugars, as well as some potentially fructans, but I will get back into that a little bit later, of overload that may cause upsets in the hindgut, because what it does, it surpasses the first part of the digestion, and it is then ending up in the fermentation fat, either the cecum or the colon, where it's fermented by bacteria, and can then lead to what we call lactic acidosis, because the bacteria that dominate and grow really well on sugary-based substrates are lactic acid bacteria, or lactic acid producing bacteria, and these can cause a massive shift in the bacterial population, going what we call from cellulitic bacteria to these lactic acid producing bacteria, and it's a variety that we have sequenced, and that can cause a lowering of the pH, and a lot of these good bacteria will die, and causes this, obviously all these cell membranes to be shredded and will be then transported through the gut into the bloodstream, and can cause this massive inflammation in the body. And that's what you see here. I'm putting big question marks because it's sometimes not really clear which ones, which pathways triggered laminitis. So that's the inflammatory response to, for instance, bacteria. But also just the body can get into an inflammation state, so it doesn't necessarily have to be through bacteria, but it can be through medication, and we'll get to that as well. But in the bigger picture, inflammation, stress, cortisol, all kinds of other mediators can also cause an inflammation in the body. So we need to be aware that we have an inflammatory response of laminitis, and typically that is linked when we're dealing with the shift in bacteria in the gut. And then the third one, and that is probably the most common one that is associated with pasture associated laminitis, is through the hormone pathway, which is typically caused by high insulin levels in the blood, high circulating levels of insulin in the blood. And it's actually caused initially by getting too much sugars in the diet, either through, mostly if we look at pasture, due to these water-soluble carbohydrates, where the body is continuously challenged to clear the glucose in the body. And after a while, because insulin is needed to transport this glucose into cells, we see that these ports don't operate anymore at the normal levels of insulin, and so the body needs to produce more insulin to get the same effect. And that's what we call, that's kind of is the stage where horses can get this insulin resistance problem. But as I said, there are also other EMS, Cushing's disease, as well as medication, corticosteroids can all cause endocrine laminitis as well. And typically some of these can be a bit related. So it's quite hard to pinpoint just one thing, and sometimes we can see no inflammation in the body, and then we can find that the horse is quite high in insulin and insulin resistance, and we are quite clear that it's caused by the hormone pathway. If we find inflammation in the body, then we can assume that it's much more of an inflammatory response, but that doesn't say that it's ruling out hormone. It can actually be an inflammation and a hormone pathway as well, and how unlucky is the horse in both of those instances. So that's why we call it a systematic disease. It's hard to pin down just one. So, and when we when we think about pasture-associated laminitis, we also kind of have linking this to carbohydrate overload, and we now know that fructans in grass seems to be less likely to cause laminitis on its own. It's probably more of a combination of simple sugars, the amount of intake, not only from pastures but also from weeds, which we'll get into it as well, and that is causing this this spike. So it can either be then an overload in the gut, or it can increase, as I said, the insulin abnormal, can cause abnormal insulin response. But a lot of people have kind of been focusing on laminitis, and they're often on fructans in the fructan model, and they found that this does occur, or this happens in an in vitro system. That means that in the lab they were able to use compounds that are fructans, and they were able to trigger the laminitis response. But when they then tried it in vivo, so in the animal, they were not consistent in finding any. And also it shows that we have to have very high levels of fructans to get to get that overload. So it's probably much more of a combination. And then also, just to confuse it even more, we have found if we go into supplements or ingredients that we can have in our diet that actually can increase our insulin response, we have actually found that fructose molecules, if we add that, we can actually increase some of the insulin sensitivity. So a little bit of that seems to actually work really well, but maybe in large amounts it could cause an overload problem, but it has not been as such very clearly confirmed. And in my opinion, and also dealing with pasture analysis, I find that there's quite a lot of simple sugars before you even think about fructans. That is the danger, and also when you think about the intake that horses are getting. So if we then also look at, well, laminitis and what is the major cause, most 61% in the UK was a survey in the 1990s on pasture or combination, very rarely stabled, and then it's also very rare to find it in stables unless obviously the horse has been on grain, and that's a little bit the trial that I did, where horses are fed grain, go on pasture, and then return back to grain, or from pasture to grain and from grain back to pasture. So it depends a little bit when the body is triggered, or when the horse is triggered first, and then it ends up in a different environment and gets a different food, but has again a sugar-based food. You can see that the body just responds in the same way, if not even worse. So so it's a bit unknown what I mean with the 9% stable, but yeah, probably more of a grain-fed problem. And then in the US, almost 50% also linked with pasture. So I think that most of you that are joining the website of a webinar have probably are dealing also with a laminitis problem that is yeah, typically pasture associated. Okay, so just to kind of finish off on well, what factors that are triggering laminitis, I just also want to highlight that there are various other factors that that can cause and result in this insulin resistance, and then a higher insulin, circulating insulin in the body. Obesity, not necessarily all horses that are obese will have this, but they have a higher risk. Genetic disposition, so horses that are a bit more heavy, draft horses, Spanish horses, generally your ponies and your good doers are indeed more susceptible to this problem, but not necessarily they will develop laminitis or these problems, because I just put here a photo, and I think that if you would see the photo on the left, people would say, oh yeah, definitely it has laminitis. But if you then look at the other horse that looks quite skinny, that horse has severe laminitis. Look at it stand, totally moving, you know, like leaning back. So not necessarily body weight is always the clue to as a pre-existing condition. Cushing's, that can cause, Cushing's is actually a problem from the pituitary gland that is causing an increase in ACTH, and then can activate the cortisol levels, which also can affect the blood glucose and insulin levels in the blood. As I said, corticosteroids works a bit similar like Cushing's, that can affect that. Lack of exercise, so we have studies have shown that exercise actually can help with insulin and creating more insulin sensitivity, so more glucose clearing. So lack of exercise can also be should also be considered in high insulin levels. And then obviously what we already discussed is high non-structural carbohydrates, or ethanol-soluble carbohydrate, which is the component where we where we can calculate the fructan component of pastures. So if you're going to do pasture analysis or hay analysis, you typically get a calculated non-structural carbohydrate, which is a collective of your water-soluble carbohydrates and ethanol-soluble carbohydrates, and then your starch. And in the analysis, they will break that down and come up with calculations to give you these either wet chemistry exact values, or they will give NRR, which is much more of an estimation based on a library, which is cheaper, but it gives you at least some indication of what is happening in your hay or in your pasture. But we'll get back to that again later. So probably up till now, this may not be quite new to you. This is something that you have already heard or you have read or spoken with specialists about. But what I want to add, and this is probably a little bit of my take on it and my kind of research interest and kind of the continuing where I would like to go with following my PhD on diet selection and understanding the effects of domestication and on the behavior and diet selection. So what we know is that obviously when we take animals from a natural state and put it and we domesticate it, a lot has changed for animals and also for other animals like dogs and cats. It affects the epigenetics. It affects the diet they're selecting and the nutrient intake, which is typically dictated by by us, by humans that offer them the foods. Energy expenditure has changed. Their behavioral patterns, even though they're still showing obviously horse behavior, we have not made them into machines yet, but the behavior has also affected obviously by domestication. But what I want to really highlight in is that domestication, particular having horses for selecting their diet, so deciding on their diets, as well as the pasture that we have been growing over so many years, which has been typically from a cattle, more from a livestock production system, can cause significant problems and what I like to call a mismatch. So it's matched in natural state, but what we see is in domestication we get a mismatch of these nutrients. And so very interesting, these ecologists and biologists that looked at diet selection in locusts, so in insects, found that they are really motivated by protein requirement, and that influences which foods they were eating. So this group, Simpson and Raubenheimer, came up with the protein leveraging theory and then studied many other animals, including bears, cats, wild animals, monkeys, also dogs, cats, and now started also a project in cattle. And they find also with all these other animals that they are motivated by protein. It's the most valuable component or nutrient source in our environment, and it helps us with obviously growth, lactation, with regenerating our cells. So amino acids are very important building blocks. And what we see is that excess carbohydrates and fats, so I'm just talking a little bit about also in humans this has been studied, that excess carbohydrates and fats will be consumed to meet the requirements of protein when foods provide low protein density, and less will be consumed when foods are protein dense. So they found that if animals are on a low protein diet, they will overeat on the food to get to that level, and then they will have a higher intake of carbohydrates or fats to get to that protein level. And this seems to be also one of the new founding theories of obesity in human populations, and this is also something that we can then put back on cats and dogs with the foods that we have designed for them, which are probably reasonably low in quality protein because it's cheaper to make, but then it's higher in carbohydrates or fats. And in horses where fats probably don't play as much of a role, but carbohydrates do, we kind of see potentially a similar problem, but that has not been studied in horses before, and as I said, I'm very, very keen to do something with that with horses. So hopefully maybe my next research project, if I can get funding, But in my opinion, and also in my thesis of my PhD, I kind of suggest that horses potentially also have I would say a protein leveraging, but also maybe a fiber leveraging, because if we go back to basics of how horses are designed, they are eating on a continuous basis, almost on a continuous basis, grasses, different vegetation, browse, and particular lower quality grasses, so they have long hours of grazing and to obtain all those nutrients. So in a way they have probably lower protein in their diet, and they have to eat more bulk to get to that protein. So that's what they are designed for in nature, to get to that protein level. But then when they are in what we call a domesticated system, this mismatch occurs with probably improved pastures, where they try to get to the protein, and while they get to that protein, they already ingested way too much carbohydrates. And then the other problem that is still a big question is about food control, is why do horses, even if they reach then protein levels or fiber, and maybe not even fiber levels, when do they have this control? When do they know to stop? When do they know if they had enough carbohydrates? And it seems to not really work well in horses, this control of carbohydrates. And also, as I talked in my previous webinar about toxins, where horses get a signal from their stomach saying, oh, I had enough of this food because it has too many toxins, I will stop now. It doesn't seem to happen with carbohydrates. Obviously, they don't get nauseous, and when they get laminitis, it doesn't happen through their gut. It happens through their feet, and they don't make a relation between the food that they were eating and feeling unpleasant in the hooves. It's a cause and effect that horses, unfortunately, that intelligent, they don't have that. So we need to really look at very basic understanding of diet selection and nutrient intake to really understand this overeating problem, and we have not really dissected it enough, in my opinion. And this is, I think, really important to understand why horses overeat, and how can we control that feed intake without starving them, because that's where we go mostly wrong in our feeding management, putting horses in Jenny Gray paddocks. So that's what I want to continue with. Feeding and management strategies to reduce the risk. So I hope I've given you a little bit of an overview on what is laminitis, what are the triggering factors, and a little bit of a new approach to how we should tackle this problem from a diet selection and nutrient intake perspective, how we then better can advise horse owners and about what we should do from a feeding point of view and management. So first, what are the factors? So we're dealing with pastures, and many people will have a variety of species, or they have a monoculture, depending if they're in a very improved system or a very livestock production system. And we know that there are various factors that influence the non-structural carbohydrate component in grasses or in pastures. So the species will dictate how much nutrient and sugar content it will have, the availability of water, the time of year, so sunlight intensity. So think about your spring and autumn for your cool climate areas, and the sunlight is most intense in summer, obviously, for the tropical regions. The time of the day, and we'll go back to that in one of our strategies, so night versus day. The availability of nutrients, so having for instance, nitrogen, potassium, all those ingredients that the plant needs for growth. That will affect also, obviously, the nutrients that are obviously collected in the tissue, as well as the sugar component. Temperature, so again, sun goes a bit together with sunlight, obviously. The stand of the sun will dictate the temperature during the year. And the stage of growth, so obviously young growing grasses versus more mature grasses will have a different composition of nutrients and sugar. So the younger it is, the more nutritious it is, and the higher the component of sugar. The more it matures, the nutrient as well as the sugar component will decrease. So what are the trigger factors? So these are just obviously things that are given. This is something that, well, you can control maybe a little bit, availability of water, and we did have a question about irrigation. So this person asked if irrigating water is helping with reducing sugar or does it increase sugar. And one of the things is that any stress, so drought, frost, overgrazing, too much fertilizer, can actually cause a plant to go in a stress situation, and that generally means that they're going to store more sugar. So if there is not enough water, it will go in stress. Too much water can cause other problems, can cause waterlogging. So a little bit of irrigation, allowing a little bit of water to the plant, is probably better than having it in a dry form, like having it in a drought form. So irrigation, from a plant scientist, they would really look strange at you if you would say that oh, you shouldn't irrigate because it will be causing problems in the pasture for sugars. It's actually the opposite. Not enough water, having not enough water will probably be more profound on the sugar content than having availability of water. Yes? So accumulation of sugars doesn't matter in what kind of species we're looking at. So even if we're talking about native pastures, we can put them under stress and they will accumulate a little bit more sugars. But the amounts that native pastures do versus improved pastures is obviously very different. So stress, overgrazing, overmowing the grass, so having very short grass is stressing the root system, is stressing the plant, and actually the stem will accumulate more sugars than the leaves. So it's actually better to have your pastures in a vegetative form rather than in a short stem kind of length. Compaction, poor soils also will contribute to obviously stressed pastures, but particularly can then introduce weeds. And if you have no pasture availability and the only thing there's there and there are weeds, we can also see in these weeds stress, and they will accumulate also sugars and even secondary compounds because they are more susceptible to overeating in a stressed form. So be very cautious that if you are in a paddock or your horse is adjusted or you have a paddock that has quite a lot of weeds but you're in a drought area, in a drought spell, then you need to be very cautious that these weeds are not eaten solely by these horses, because Julie already suggested to me or mentioned to me that they had horses dying of soursop, which is a weed that can accumulate as a monoculture through pastures in Victoria and in South Australia. And it has the oxalate, so it has oxalic acid, and in high quantities can cause hypocalcemia. So it causes acute calcium deficiency, and unless you get a vet out that can intravenously give you calcium, your horse may not make it. So these are things to really consider. So it's not only just the pasture. We also have to make sure that you do some weed management if that's the case. So what do we do? How can we manage our pastures? So pasture preparation and management. And because the webinar, we have only such a short time and I want to discuss so many things, I'm going to keep it very brief. We already, in many of the previous webinars on pasture management and property design, we already tackled them. So it's probably much more of a summary. And if you're interested to know much more about of these subjects, I suggest that you go through our YouTube list with previous webinars. So first of all, what can we do? Leaf area management. That's one of the preps. Think about the leaves of your grasses. They are lower in non-structural carbohydrates than the stems. As I told you, having them in a vegetative growth rather than in a stem, or setting them when they're coming into seed, those are things that you can manage by mowing or slashing the head. So obviously don't mow it to the base, but have it still, depending on how much grass height you have, but slash the tips off, and you will allow for leafy regrowth and reduce the seed head production. That is something that you can do before, around spring and around any time that you see that the pasture gets this growth spurt and starts to put these seed heads on. You can come in with your tractor and slash the tips off, which helps with reducing any of the seeds to be consumed by the horses, but also that the pasture is not, the energy that the plant is instead putting into the seed is then used into leaf matter, and leaf matter has a lower non-structural carbohydrate. So keeping it in a vegetative form is one, leaf area management, which actually coincides as well with rotational grazing, so actually going one step going to the bottom, to the blue bar. Encouraging recovery and growth of pasture. Really avoid overgrazing. Jenny Craig paddocks are really bad for horses. They, as I said, accumulate more sugars in the stem. Pastures are stressed, so you need to make sure that you have leaf area, that you have and can manage this and encourage it to recover and grow. So moving horses through your paddocks, having enough cells is very important, and again we've been addressing this in one of our previous webinars. So that's your pastoral rotational management, your grazing planning. We'll get to ideas. If you don't have enough pasture, what do? I will get back to that. Soil development. As I said, weeds, poor soils is very dangerous for laminitic horses because you can substantially accumulate these monoculture weeds that are the only ones that can grow there, that are doing a real hard job to be in your soil, but they are also stressed and causing these sugar accumulation. So key lining, to compact pastures, we already addressed this, composting, mulching, to develop soil if you don't have a key line plow or plowing system that can help you. It is not about cultivating it, it's about allowing some air and decompaction to happen using a plowing system. So it's not cultivating it. Biostimulant and compost tea are also really good to be and safe to be used on pastures. It doesn't create a spike in nitrogen and then in massive over-fertilization. It actually is much more of a pre-probiotic for pre and probiotic for the soil to really kickstart the microorganisms that break down your organic matter, that build soil, that allow pastures then to germinate in less compacted soil and thrive in that. If you have so much problem and it's so compacted and just you have the wrong species, too many weeds, probably the best thing for you is to cultivate it, I would say, and then sow pasture mix suitable for horses. Ideally, indeed, a mixture, depending on where you are and what is available. A native and low non-structural carbohydrate imported species is typically what I would advise. I would not go, unless you can, fully native, but it's not that bad to have some. I don't want to say that imported species are per se bad. It's just some of the types that we have to be aware of. And then obviously, most important, it's about biodiversity. So even if you have some of the ryegrass in it or fescue or any of that, it's not necessarily bad. It's just if it's a monoculture, then it can be quite dangerous for laminitic horses or sugar-sensitive horses. But if you have a bit of it, but you have also your native windmill grass, wallaby grass, or if you're in a tropical system, Rhodes grass and a little bit of kangaroo grass, you know, it's all about balance, and nature is not designed about monoculture. So avoiding that is probably the best advice, and use sowing techniques with right suitable pasture mix. Julie has mentioned that they do regular workshops on these native pastures. So I would suggest that you check out their event list and see if something is coming up either or like via webinar, similar like what we do now. Okay, so then the second strategy that we can use is grazing time and planning. So most people are quite aware that we can reduce, maybe restrict some of the hours of grazing, but we have to be very cautious because research in the UK has shown that when they locked up ponies, that in 1 hour or within 3 hours they were able to consume almost the same amount as what they would do on a 10-hour or like a 24-hour pasture turnout. So we have to be very cautious with the behavior of the horse. So if you deprive the horse of food during those hours and then the horse goes out and it just goes, okay, I need to store it now because, you know, like my life depends on it because I will be locked up in that box again. Those are behaviors you need to be very cautious of. So on a continuous basis, we need to think about feeding, and I will get back to that when we talk about supplementary feeding. When you're going to lock up your horse, what can we do? Strip grazing, also a very good technique. So that means strip grazing is pretty much using electric tape and moving little areas forward with a little bit of fresh grass, so that the horse is not getting a large piece of grass. So you're kind of moderating the intake on a daily basis. So strip grazing should be done pretty much moving every day a little bit, so that they always have a little bit of fresh grass, and that you avoid obviously the overgrazing in the area that they've been. So you want to kind of close down as well as moving forward. So it's kind of like a moving strip. I would not say you leave everything open. You're just moving it along so that you can think about the recovery of that pasture that has been grazed. Grazing mussels, that's another tool. We have to be, again, cautious with first introducing the horse to it. If it's a naive horse, don't chuck it just on, really, spend some time, put some grass through the little hole, put a carrot through it, get them comfortable with it, make them associated with food rather than with stress of not getting, getting food. Also, the hours that you put it on, you may want to restrict it to a couple of hours. Most advise not more than 3. I have experience with people that do the feeding, doing the muscle grazing during the night, which is, probably a 10-hour window, 8 to 10-hour window. That should be feasible, but if you know that your horse is just struggling and shows very behavioral frustration, maybe not so good idea. So again, you need to approach it individually. Not all horses are the same, and also it may be something that just really feels not so good with yourself, because obviously, when you put a muscle on, for a lot of people that are non-horsey, it looks very strange. Why would you, do that? But it is obviously to protect the horse from overeating on some of these lush pastures. So grazing mussel can be a tool. I don't think it's necessarily one thing, like strip grazing, restricting hours. It's probably a combination. Again, thinking a bit holistically about which strategies can I put in place, which are feasible, which ones can I manage, and do I want to manage, and put them all together, and you probably have a better outcome. So also the time of grazing. So we know from research, here's a nice graph from Longland in 2007 looking at the water-soluble content of pasture, that showing in the morning, and then during the day, and then in the evening. And you see that during the night, when the sunlight disappears, that's when the plant starts to utilize start to assimilate it, and you will see a lowering of water-soluble carbohydrates in the plant. So it could be a very good strategy to graze your horse during the night, so particularly around spring and maybe during autumn, where if you're in the southern, if you're in the southern part of Australia, or if you're in the northern hemisphere during spring, and for horses in the tropical system, where people think that laminitis doesn't occur, but it still happens also on tropical species. On tropical pastures, it's just during the summer when the water-soluble carb content of pastures are mostly accumulated. So it depends a bit on the species as well, if you're in a tropical or in a temperate system. So those are ways to manage the time, and then we can, if we are struggling, or if we really are a bit worried about our pastures and it just seems to just be maybe too difficult to manage fully, additional strategies when pastures are rich can be adopted. So we can create no grass areas, so sacrifice areas. We can think about yarding, stabling. I find that when laminated horses are, unless they obviously have a severe foot displacement, or like the coffin bone has been really kind of rotated, no movement, but most of horses would do really well with a little bit of movement. It will help with blood flow, and also keeping the horse more sane, reducing that behavioral, kind of behavioral frustration and things like that. So ideally, maybe something like a yard or laneway system, so creating like a paddock paradise. You see here, for instance, like a laneway system central points where horses can still hang out, because it can be very frustrating. Most people will have one horse that develops laminitis and the rest are all fine and can go on the big pasture. So what do? You still want to kind of offer them a group situation. You can have them in these central point systems with a special footing, that it may be a little bit of forest or a little bit of pasture access, or you can totally have them locked up in that area, and then obviously think about slow feeding systems and enrichment. We'll get to that in the next slides. Encouragement of movement, feeding and using feeding and water points. So you can see here like having a slow feeding system in the laneways, and they have to walk again around the property if they want to get to the water. That can help as well with just encouraging the movement, as well as that you can have different feeding stations with different types of forages that can help with the enrichment. So slow feeding, you can have them hay nets, slow feeding hay nets hanging up on trees on the track. There's different types. Just, you know, if you do a Google search, you can have them hanging, so having more of a lower neck frame, because not everybody likes the idea of just having hay nets always hanging, although a little bit of an elevated neck for browsing seems to actually be really good for the vertebrae, and is used also a lot for recovery of patients, like horses that have back problems. But you know, you want to have it also maybe on the ground, so you can have something hanging up high, you can have something hanging up low, you can have different types of forages. So maybe a lucerne based is then a hay based. Very important is that you avoid any of these. You can make your own, like you can be very creative. For the trees is one of the things that we already addressed many times in our webinar, and I will get back to that a little bit later. So whatever works for you, you can create it yourself. Depends a bit on your system. Most people probably will already adopt something similar, and not necessarily. Some horses can do really well with not necessarily having a hay, like a full-on slow feeding hay net. They can maybe just have the hay without the net, if you can find, you know, low quality, and they don't seem to eat too much. They're reasonably well with eating throughout the day, but most of these systems work really well for like horses that have overweight or laminitis. Or so talking then about, well, what hay, because obviously hay is also obviously produced from grass, and that can contain also sugars. So we need to be very aware that we don't starve horses. So we need to still think, unless we have overweight horses, that as the last two slides that I'm going to talk about, overweight management, but the daily total intake should still be 1.5% of the body weight of the horse at minimum, and 2 is kind of more considered the standard. We need to then look at the quality. We may need to look at analyzing our hay to avoid very high pastures and high in sugar. We can, for instance, soak hay to reduce waterable soluble carbohydrate content. This has shown in studies depending on the type of hay as well as the temperature of the water and the time, can be somewhere between 9 to 60% of reduction of sugars. But we need to be very aware that the water, depending on the temperature and also the length, can also significantly proliferate bacteria and reduce the hygiene of pasture. So we need to be quite cautious of that. The other option is steaming hay. A combination of soaking and then steaming has shown to be the most successful in reducing sugars as well as and keeping the hygiene. But obviously you will also lose some of the nutrient components, so you may have to then look at some of particularly the vitamins to supplement horses. But that can be a good strategy. So soaking hay, steaming hay, but be very aware that you don't have it in high temperatures, that you don't leave it for long, and that you obviously don't feed the water that you just soaked everything in back to the horses. So you need to put that on your plans. Also feeding times, obviously we need to think about feeding for a long time to keep the horse occupied. So we should stimulate foraging behavior at least 8 hours of the 24. and we should avoid fasting periods of less than 4 hours. And these are the new recommendations, and the paper was released in 2016 in November, so these are very brand new recommendations, but it's been already knowledge for many years. It's just kind of reinforcing that we just need to make sure that we keep feeding to the horse's design, which is eating on an almost continuous basis. So that's where the slow feeding and obviously soaking hay, where you can increase the bulk a little bit but reduce the sugars, can really help. Also, roughage type, think about long stem to help with slowing down eating and produce more saliva, so having very fine chopped food makes the horse obviously not work for it. Variety can also help with that horses move between 2 feeding stations, so have a lucerne and a grass hay. So those are things to consider. And analyze your hay. It's very well advised to, if you can buy a batch and you work with a produce or a hay producer. I think that's the future. I think that hay producers for horses should maybe already have a label or have some analysis from their batches from each year or from each cut. But we don't do that yet. But that's something that is now still a responsibility for us as horse owners that may be dealing with horses that are sensitive for sugar sensitive, laminitic, or having obesity or quickly gains weight. So we need to really take that own responsibility at this stage and and analyze the hay. So if you're dealing with horses that gain quickly weight on pasture or on any food pretty much, we need to just first mention that there's no universal accepted definition of obesity, so it's kind of suggested on the Henneke body condition score of 8 and 9, so pretty much as high as you can go up the scale. But we kind of suggest that by 7 we can consider maybe overweight, but again, depending with which breed and which sporting discipline you work with, they probably say when you're in a hunter class that that horse looks amazing and looks really healthy, whether maybe veterinarians and nutritionists would go, that horse is quite on the unhealthy side. So it's the perception of people in our industry, and particularly in particular breed and sporting disciplines, that we need to be very aware of, because they're pushing horses to a very unhealthy weight. And in the end, you're the one, maybe not now, but in 20 years, or if you're going to have and care for this horse for long time, or 18 years, how old the horse can can cause these problems, these potential insulin-related hormone problems, and may result in laminitis. So higher risk of the disease due to these fat deposits, but we have to say that not all horses that are obese develop laminitis, and not all obese horses will develop insulin resistance. And there's other factors that may exist there. So we already talked about the inflammatory response. Having horses that are starved and not getting, so they're overweight and then they're cut on their food, can cause also a stress response in the body, and may also create these mediators in the body that could result in laminitis or higher levels of insulin in the body. So overall stress in the body of the horse, depending on probably its makeup, its genetics, its character, name it. There's probably so many factors. The horse may actually get an inflammatory response, where the other horses may still, if it doesn't get food, it deals with it, where the other horses can get very stressed. So we need to be very aware of that. So what can we do with reducing the overweight? Yes, eat less, exercise more, but don't starve the horse. So you need to look much more between still around 1.25% of the body weight, and then try and still keep it as much as possible to the 1.5. Some people have suggested, but only under guided, I would say only under guided supervision, 1% of the body weight in roughage and total feed intake. But I would be very cautious with that. It needs to be done under very strict management. But around 1.25, 1.5 of the body weight is where you have to look at. no calorie, like high calorie food. So cereals and oils need to be eliminated from this diet. Also carrots, apples, anything sugar that has sugar content. You need to think about the time of grazing, which we already addressed, pasture management. You need to be realistic about the workloads. Start off with a short training program and then increase the workload. And again, advise with a physiologist or a veterinarian that can help you with that. And it also depends on the hoofs of the horse. If it had a real bout of laminitis already, it's end fat and it's overweight fat, and it has also still tender hoofs, exercise may be out of the question. So you may have to just walk the horse. Think about those husbandry, strategies of laneway systems and making the horse move between water and food. A target weight should be set, and there should be a management program. You need to obviously monitor weight, the body condition score, and it's a long-term commitment. So it's not something that will happen overnight. So it is something that you probably have to again, tailor to each horse. What works for one horse may not work for the other, and again, I advise that you get, professional help with that. When we talk about additional foods, talking first about concentrate feeding, most horses can do without concentrates, exception of minerals and vitamins. Avoid foods that are high in sugar that can increase, that can cause or can exacerbate the insulin resistance. So cereals and obviously very high sugary pastures. If you need to still add a little bit of bulk to their diet, and you want to avoid, you find it hard to find the right pasture, you can then pasture hay. You can use low GI foods such as the super fibers, such as beet pulp, soybean hulls, or legume hulls, copra and sunflower hulls. They can all be used as a fiber component that doesn't increase that doesn't peak the glucose and insulin response as what we see, for instance, with our cereals and sugary pastures. So that can be added, but again, do you need it? Are you not overfeeding then again your horse if you're dealing, for instance, with an overweight horse? If you have a reasonably skinny horse that has laminitis or just a moderate body condition, and you want to still add to its diet without pushing those sugars, and as I said, maybe it's hard to analyze your hay or find the right type of hay, then these can be a very good addition. So they're not disregarded. It's absolutely crucial in some diets to be incorporated. Unless your horse is overweight, but in other cases, use oil instead of cereals, particularly if it's a sporting horse and you recovered from laminitis and then you want to sport it and it needs a bit more energy and needs to gain a little bit of weight, use oils instead of cereals. Make sure that you add an antioxidant, so vitamin E, and no more than 100 milliliters per 100 kilograms of body weight. And oils is also a very good component from an anti-inflammatory perspective, so your omega oils. So then looking at supplements, so I'm kind of finishing my talk on supplements, and I think that a lot of people, when they are dealing with laminitic horses, one of the first things they may look for is like supplements or foods that they can give to their horse to help with, like similar to diabetes in humans. What can I feed to my horse to help with the insulin response, and what can I feed to help with the repair of the hoof? So most of us will be familiar with minerals, vitamins, amino acids, gut health, and a lot of interest obviously in herbs and spices. So with minerals, it has shown that magnesium, zinc, chromium, palladium, molybdenum, all are minerals, trace minerals that can help with increasing the insulin response, the insulin sensitivity. It can lower blood glucose, And these have been also studied, some of these have also been studied in relation with horses, but most has been done in humans and in rats. Vitamins, as I said, the antioxidant can help with free radicals, it's generally combined in the oil as an anti-inflammatory supplement. Biotin for hoof health, I think that most people are quite familiar with a hoof supplement, but biotin can help with just that repair with particular that chronic state horse that can be beneficial. If horses had an inflammatory response, particular laminitis through upset in the hindgut, vitamin B or vitamin B complex can help with restoring some of that balance, because pretty much horses can make their own, can synthesize through bacteria their own vitamin B complex. But obviously when they're sick or they had antibiotics or they had some upset in the gut, then adding vitamin B can help. Amino acids, obviously also very important for the repair of the laminae. So most people, or a lot of people, may be aware of lucerne, feeding lucerne as a component in the diet. But again, don't overfeed on lucerne, because it can add to the energy as well. So it's lower. Lucerne is lower in non-structural carbohydrates as a legume compared to most other grass species, but you still have to obviously not overfeed it. But it can be, lucerne can be incorporated as one of your forage sources in the diet of the horse. Gut health, so if you're dealing with horses that maybe are on a high grain diet, or you have ex-race horses that you're rehabbing, or you are aware that your horse may have had an inflammatory response of an overload of sugars on pastures through the gut, then pre and probiotics can help. Again, don't overdo it. It can also cause then upset if you overdo. So the right amounts are very important. So if you want to do something with pre-probiotics, is do your research and talk with a nutritionist or veterinarian that can advise you, or the product company, how much you should feed for your horse. And then herbs and spices, that is over the last years, even though it has been around in Chinese medicine and in many other cultures like native and indigenous cultures around the world, it is something that is probably more popularly studied over the last years. In particular, spices such as acacia's cinnamon, turmeric, ginger, fenugreek, and licorice are interesting spices that have shown to help with insulin sensitivity and clearance, glucose clearance. And a little bit has been done, or most has been done with humans and rats, but I think more research, targeted research, should be done with horses. So there's not a lot out there. There's only suggestion of it. Yeah, it's probably something that we need to pick up on and do more research about. So those may be some that you come across if you go into stores or you go online and you find supplements for laminitic horses. But don't get yourself confused, or because a lot of companies will advertise that they're for laminitis and they make really big claims. So be very cautious with any companies that make big claims about that it will prevent or totally cure or any in those form words, because it depends so much obviously on the species of herbs they use, because when they did research with cinnamon, it's only certain cinnamon that can do it, that have the property in it. Then it's the amounts, the grading of, for instance, turmeric has also a component and comes in different grading, so an 8 grading, like a AAA grading. So those are things that you need to really, really focus on if you go and shop around for supplements. If they make too many claims and they're not registered with the APVMA in Australia, then yeah, you have to be a bit cautious with their claims. and really suss out if they state the ingredients on there and the quantities of ingredients, and if they're very approachable. So if you ring them or you email them and you want to have more information, are they willing to give you the scientific studies that they can back it up with? Doesn't necessarily have to be their studies, but it has to be some of their research or their R&D that they have to be able to give to their clients. So transparency is a big thing, I think, when selecting supplements, and that's also I think what most horse owners should look for. And then finally, obviously, if you suspect laminitis, contact your veterinarian for diagnosis and treatment. Don't get your mate from the agistment or down the road. Really get an expert in, because if it's going into an acute phase, it was only like a 24 to 72 hour window that you need to treat it. Testing your horse for insulin resistance or Cushing's, also contact your veterinarian. Pain treatment, x-raying, that can all just help with obviously pain treatment, making it a bit more bearable for your horse. X-raying just to see where it currently is, and obviously to have a staged recovery and look at especially if you're dealing with displacement in the hoof capsule, that you can monitor it if it's repairing. And the severity when it's fully recovered. Is the horse able to get back to a full sporting life? Can it be still a recreation horse? Does it still have pain? Those are things that you need to consult with a veterinarian. Nutritionists like myself can be very useful to help with diet formulation and feeding management advice. Well, I already gave you many suggestions in this webinar, and I really hope you learn something from it, or you can walk away with some of these ideas and then research yourself a little bit more. Or contact me if you really want to have a more tailored advice. I can help, for instance, or not only me, but there's many other nutritionists. I want to speak for all of them. We can help with all of that, with hay analysis. In my case, I do also pasture analysis and pasture planning, and obviously the feed. No horse, no feed, no horse. So farrier in conjunction with maybe some veterinarian advice to help with what to do with correcting the hoof stand, either barefoot or with corrective shoeing or corrective adjustments, including some may need to use some boots because the horse is very tender. So there's a lot out there, and get your advice from certified people. That's very important. I have here a reference list of some of the studies that that will back up some of the facts and some of the suggestions that I made earlier on about the trigger factors of laminitis, some of the sugar components and the fructan components in pastures. So here's a list, and what I will do is put this list in the email and answer any additional questions if people have those. And we also have still the book, the Equine Permaculture, Pasture Management and Property Design book available online. We'll place a link. We'll have a link in the email as well for that, and any upcoming events, including potentially these. Keep an eye on these native pasture ones. As I said at the beginning, I'm working on getting the equine permaculture courses happening together under a new umbrella. So that's going to be the Integrative Equine and Environmental Science Education. So that's going to be the new website. Again, now that my PhD is finished, I'm going to work on that. And I hope to launch that so that then equine permaculture as well as the consultancy will fall under this umbrella. But they will all be still available either on Facebook, or you can follow it on the websites. But we're working on that online platform. So I want to thank everybody that are still awake and supporting Horse SA with attending these webinars. Also want to thank Adelaide and Mountie Love Rangers, the NRM, for their continuous funding reports, because without them we cannot do these educational webinars for you guys. So thank you, and hope to have you again with our next webinar.